It was in the opening years of the 12th century that the first of the hunters set foot in Scotland. Little is known of these early Norman adventurers, except that they arrived in Britain in the service of William the Conqueror as huntsmen and keepers of the forest. Subsequently, they were invited to Scotland by the Scottish King David I, where they were allotted the land which became Hunterston. Their first stronghold was probably a wooden bailey situated on the site of the present castle. There is no sign of a defensive motte or mound, the common foundation for so many Norman fortifications, presumably because the natural protection afforded by the marshland which surrounded the site rendered such a feature unnecessary. In the 13th century, King Alexander III of Scotland urged his noblemen on the western coast to build more permanently in stone to strengthen his defences against the resurgent Norsemen. It was probably around this time that the Peel Tower was constructed. The hunters' workforce found their most convenient material in sandstone quarried locally, and the tower house, much as we know it today, began to rise from the ground. Looking up at the roof, we can see that the gables are stepped. These steps were used for access to maintain the roof. The present stone slates are not the original covering, which was most likely to have been thatch made from locally gathered reeds. In times of siege, these would have been doused with water as a precaution against fire. At that time, the Hunterston Peninsula was a wild and uncultivated area where trackless fens provided a natural barrier against enemies, and there was no lack of these. Raids from the sea were a continual threat, and attacks by wandering bands of robbers or political dissidents were an ever-present danger. Further, the death of Alexander, the last of the Canmore dynasty, pitched Scotland into a cauldron of war that was to bubble for centuries. We do not know for certain which side the hunters allied themselves to during the ensuing Wars of Independence, which began at the close of the 13th century. The 8th Laird of Hunterston, Aylmer le Huntar, was a known supporter of Scottish King John Balliol, whose cause was championed by William Wallace. The great Scottish hero had local connections, and his rebellion was strongly supported in Ayrshire. Hope for the kingship focused on the Earl of Carrick, Robert the Bruce. He finally settled the issue by beating the English at Bannockburn in 1314. It was a critical time for the Scots nobility. The wrong decision meant death or the confiscation of land. The hunters, however, retained their estates. The clan's occupation of the land was confirmed by a charter signed by King Robert II of Scotland in 1374. This document, now frail and faded, is still in the family's possession. In the 16th century, the castle was extended to include the Great Hall and staircase. As times became more peaceful, Hunterston Castle remained the family's home and the administrative centre for their extensive estates. The buildings surrounding the courtyard were built during the 18th and 19th centuries as stables, storehouses and accommodation. Of the previous 29 lairds of Hunterston, 4 have been women, including the present clan chief Pauline Mullen, Hunter of Hunterston.
Welcome to Hunterston Castle. This has been the stronghold of the Hunter clan for over 800 years. We'll begin the tour of the original Peel Tower in the basement. Peel towers of this period usually had only one entrance, sealed by a stout wooden door. This made them much easier to defend.
We can see above us the barrel-vaulted roof, which was a common feature of structures of this time, and of which this is a very fine example. It also provides an extremely secure foundation for the huge weight of stone above.
The defending clansfolk had their own water supply, and we can see from the circle in the present concrete floor where the old well used to be. This arrow slit would have been used by a bowman if the castle was under siege. It would have given him a wide field of fire, while at the same time protecting him from assailants outside. A ladder, similar to this reconstruction, would have given access from the basement to the living quarters above.
The entrance was secured by a sturdy trapdoor, which would have been difficult to force and was easily defended from above if the basement had been penetrated by the enemy.
The trapdoor opens into the old hall.
Prior to the construction of the Great Hall, this was the heart of the Hunter household. The original wooden floor was strewn with rushes gathered from the surrounding marshes. When soiled, they were thrown down into the moat of swampy water which once encircled the castle.
They were probably jettisoned through the guardrobe here, which served as a rubbish chute as well as a toilet.
The complete darkness in which you were enclosed was relieved only by a single candle placed in this niche. Although this was probably regarded as state-of-the-art sanitation at the time, we can only imagine, fortunately, what the smell must have been like. However, it was the height of luxury compared with the squalid conditions which existed in the hovels clustered around the castle in medieval times. At night, all the heat and most of the light came from this fireplace, originally much larger, which was also used for cooking. Tallow candles were used to supplement the firelight. At this side of this embrasure is a small alcove used probably for cold storage of food. Set in the wall between the window and the guardrobe is an ancient carving of a hunter's horn in soft sandstone. It was once set in the outside wall, but was brought inside to preserve it. The staghorn furniture is not medieval, although it evokes the spirit of the times. It was brought from Bavaria by honeymooners Jane and Gould Hunter Weston in the mid-19th century. The furniture, which has some finely carved details, has been covered with Hunter of Hunterston tartan. Looking upwards at the ceiling, we can see the original oak beams resting on top of stone corbels.
Formerly, a massive timber door would have hung here from these large hinges. It would have been held shut against intruders by a heavy timber bar.
We can see the deep socket in which it was lodged.
At night, or in times of uncertainty, it was drawn across into the retaining recess in the stone jamb opposite. In earlier times, a timber staircase would have provided the main access, but now the old hall opens into the Great Hall, built in the 15th century. This large hall was built to provide more room and comfort, and is dominated by an impressive fireplace.
During restoration earlier this century, a finely carved lintel was added, showing the Hunter coat of arms.
Larger windows made this room much lighter and airier than the old hall. Like the old hall, this floor was strewn with rushes, which, when dirty, was swept out through this floor-level chute.
This ancient chest, which originally held family papers, is furnished with an early but very intricate locking mechanism.
Two of the most valued symbols of the Hunter heritage are the Charter of 1374 and the Hunterston brooch.
The Hunterston brooch represents the peak of Celtic craftsmanship and remains one of the most precious heirlooms of Scotland's heritage. It is exquisitely crafted from solid silver and intricately decorated with gold filigree depicting Celtic animals and set with stones of amber. While the brooch probably left its maker's hands in the 8th century or earlier, two of its later Scandinavian owners inscribed their names in runes on the reverse, Malbridge and Ulfriti. Its history is as mysterious as its beauty. In 1830, it was unearthed by workmen digging drains on the Hunterston estate below the cliff called Hawking Crag. Nearby, they discovered human remains. How did it come to lie there with the bones of the last individual to possess it? To many, the runic legends suggest a possible connection with the Battle of Largs. In the year 1263, the longships of the Norwegian King Haakon were approaching the Clyde coast as King Alexander had foreseen. This was a last attempt to reassert dwindling Viking influence over the west of Scotland. A Scottish army assembled at Glengarnock Castle, once an important military centre, but now a seldom visited picturesque ruin in the hills above Kilbirnie. From here, the Scottish host descended to the coast to confront the army of Haakon on the foreshore at Largs, somewhere near the spot where this memorial to the confrontation now stands. After a series of ferocious engagements, the Norsemen were defeated. It was an encounter in which the Hunters, as one of the region's most prominent families and owing allegiance to the Scottish king, almost certainly took a leading part. Indeed, skirmishes were probably fought on Hunter land. It has been suggested that the brooch belongs to a Norseman who was wounded at Largs and died in flight from the battle. Another possibility is that a looter who had plucked the brooch from a corpse on the battlefield fell with his plunder from Hawking Crag in the darkness.
Access to the upper floors of the castle is gained by a narrow stone spiral staircase from the old hall. In common with most other examples of its type in Scotland, this staircase is of a right-handed or clockwise construction. This gave a right-handed defender the advantage over a right-handed attacker, which worked well enough in the law of averages. We can see here where hunter hands have worn away the stone over the centuries.
Here we have the family bedroom. It was common practice in earlier times at every level of society for all members of the family to share the same sleeping quarters. This arrangement would have offered little privacy. Possibly they would have slept in box or shuttered beds, which offered at least some privacy and protection from drafts. The bed itself is not authentic, although the headboard is Jacobean. Like the old hall, this room also has a garderobe with the same insanitary disadvantages. The windows are, of course, small, not only to protect residents from attack, but also because glass was very expensive. It's unlikely that these windows were glazed until much later in the castle's history. The wall press was used to store clothing and was originally fitted with a wooden door. The fireplace has, as we can see, been altered many times because of smoke problems. The room is near the top of the castle and the chimney short. Strong local winds must have blown the smoke back down into the room.
It was in this chamber that Robert Caldwell Hunter, the 25th Laird, was born in 1799. He was the last clan chief to be born in the castle. The next flight of stairs leads us to the attic. Access to the attic was originally by a wooden ladder. It was improved in the early 20th century by architect Robert Lorimer.
This room may at one time have been divided into two. Heat and light were supplied by a fireplace and two small windows. Looking upwards, we see the original roof beams. If you look closely, you can see the carpenter's marks. The timbers are abutted to the wall by a cleverly crafted combination of tie beams and mortise and tenon joints. They are secured by wooden pegs.
A small but well-bolted door opens onto the parapet. Although it may have been inconvenient for an armed man to get out through this small opening, it was just as difficult for an enemy to get in. The size of the doorway has, of course, no bearing on the stature of medieval Scots. It is narrow and there was little room to manoeuvre, but this would have given the defenders the advantage of dealing with attackers one at a time. However, there were drawbacks for the defenders too. There was little room to manipulate a longbow in these battlements. Crossbows, which were more compact and a favourite weapon of the Normans, would have been brought to bear on the enemy.
The attackers could also, of course, be showered with spears, stones, and other missiles. Looking out from the parapet, the strategic advantages of the siting of Hunterston Castle are no longer as obvious as they were to the military instincts of the first hunters. The trees of the park and Hunterston House all but obscure the view of the islands of Arran and Cumbria and up the sea lanes of the Firth of Clyde, the most likely direction of attack. But in the end, these threats came to nothing, and this building sheltered the hunters safely for the best part of 500 years. It still remains the heart of the clan. A desire for more comfort combined with social image prompted the 24th Laird, Eleonora Hunter, and her husband Robert Caldwell to begin building Hunterston House. Standing a few hundred yards from the castle, it was originally a modest Georgian building designed by architect Fred Tittering. It was further extended by the 25th Laird, Robert Caldwell Hunter, and early in the present century, the 27th Laird, Lieutenant General Sir Aylmer Hunter Weston, added an additional story and enlarged the house further, depriving it, some might say, of its original economic grace. Horses were stalled in the buildings surrounding the castle to cater for the hunters' continuing passion for hunting and riding. Less deadly pastimes included squash in the house's own court or a leisurely game of croquet on the lawns. In the evening, family and guests ascended to dinner up a staircase dominated by one of the house's most notable features, the stained glass windows. In stunning colour, the panels display the heraldic history of the dynasty over many generations. With an aperitif, they relaxed and chatted in the oak hall with its impressive fireplace before being summoned to a meal in a dining room dominated by the rather severe images of hunter ancestors, as it is to this day. After dinner, sunset offered them a spectacular view of the unspoiled Firth of Clyde. The estate required management, and many hunters pursued political and military careers in which they were to distinguish themselves. In 1956, the South of Scotland Electricity Board applied for a compulsory purchase order for Hunterston farmland. Although this was fiercely resisted by Eleonora Hunter, the 28th Laird, a public inquiry which had found in her favour was overruled by the then Secretary of State for Scotland. 2 nuclear power stations rose nearby, but worse was to follow. The British Steel Company was drawn to Hunterston by the proximity of the deep water channel to its works near Ravenscraig. Soon, a mile-long jetty culminating in 2 massive loading cranes crept out across the sands. A huge artificial island bearing a construction platform for oil rigs rose just beyond the foreshore. The Hunter holdings shrank to a mere 40 acres of land around the house and castle. Farming income was slashed. Hunterston was, at least for the moment, saved from further development by the collapse of the steel industry in the 1980s. The rusting gantries of the ore terminal found little work. Ravenscraig closed. But the damage had been done. And in a changing world, who knows when the eyes of industrialists will fall upon Hunterston again. Meanwhile, the hunters of today are determined to see that the traditions of the clan and its seat survive into the 21st century.